you've written numerous books about neuroscience, especially focusing on the female brain. And as a husband, that's honestly especially
Oh, good.
interesting because, well, it's always good to learn more and to kind of further develop, right, and understand the opposite even better. And the first question I want to lead with is, what is the most surprising fact you've discovered about the female brain specifically?
Hmm. Oh my goodness, there's just so many. Every single day I learn something new. I think the well, I suppose there's so many papers which have come out. It's so hard to choose. If I had to choose one,
You could choose many. It's completely fine.
I've got kind of two in mind. One is about a paper that came out a couple of years ago looking at sex differences in terms of brain structure of people in their 30s. So early, sort of early mid adulthood, whatever you call the ages of 30. And it was looking at gender equality and inequality in different countries. And it found that in countries where there was more gender equality, male and female brains were more similar in structure. And in countries where there was greater gender inequality, these places like Brazil and India, there was more differences in brain structure. The male brains were the same everywhere. It was the female brains in countries where there was greater inequality that kind of showed a difference. And it wasn't a large difference. It's about, kind of overlapping standard deviations or overlapping normal curves. But I thought that was really interesting to me because it gives me a really clear sense of how to start talking about brain sex differences, and that there's biological sex, but then there's the experiences we have, there's biology and there's biography, and a brain that grows up without opportunities and enriched experiences and education, that does shape and sculpt that brain. So that's kind of one finding there, which really, I think, fits really nicely into that nature-nurture kind of conundrum that, it's always going to be a bit of both. And I think that paper just explains that so clearly. I really like talking about that study when it comes to talking about sex differences. But then the other paper that I think, really shaped how I think about women's health was a paper that came out written by Susanna Carmona and Alcelina Hoxima. They published it in the very, very end of 2016 in Nature Neuroscience, looking at how pregnancy shapes and sculpts the female brain through the course of their first pregnancy, and that the brain undergoes this enormous structural reorganization, mostly in areas of the brain involved with social cognition. So thinking about what other people are thinking and feeling, and it's as if pregnancy is preparing the brain and the mind for motherhood. And I think that paper really kind of, it launched a book, right? I wrote a whole book. I ended up writing one of my whole books on that topic. So they would probably be two of my favorite findings around, and there's probably 100 others I could talk about as well.
But does that mean that kind of the brain at birth is pretty much similar, more or less, and then it really develops through when you go through life with the hormones, which is different for men and females, right? And so on. Is that kind of the case?
Babies are born with, more similarities than differences, but there are very small sex differences. And when we're looking at sex differences in the brain, we've got to think a brain could be 1,000 different things that we could measure. We could measure size and shape and look at different kind of components and parts of that brain and look at their size and their shape and their connectivity and the number of neurons. And as you get older, you can look at how you process information and cognitive tests and behavioral outcomes. So there's hundreds of measures that you can take. And certainly, in utero life, so before you're born, when you're still inside your mother, male brains are shaped and sculpted by the presence of testosterone from those babies' own testes. Female brains are kind of shielded actually from any estrogen that they or their mother synthesize and release. So the baby female kind of develops, as they say, by default, and then the baby male body and brain is shaped and sculpted by the presence of estrogen and actually by the testosterone, and actually in the brain testosterone is converted to estrogen. But essentially all of that does in utero is kind of almost lay the foundations for the kind of the reproductive circuitry of those brains to be activated in puberty by female sex hormones or male sex hormones in puberty. There are some slight differences if you looked at like 1,000 male babies and 1,000 female babies, primarily in terms of size, because male babies are typically bigger, so their brains are bigger, so you've got a bigger brain driving around a bigger body. But that trajectory, if we start to see a divergence in one measure or another, we need to be very careful and thoughtful about, is that being driven purely by biology or purely by biography? And it's sometimes both, and it's sometimes one or the other, because it depends which of the measures we're looking at, because there's 1,000 measures that you could make. You could look at memory, you could look at size, you could look at susceptibility to disease, you could look at I don't know, receptor numbers in the amygdala. There's 1,000 different things that you could look at.
And what is your definition of the baby brain, maybe for the people who haven't had the chance yet to read the book?
Oh, to read my whole book. So baby brain, I called the book Baby Brain because it's not about the brains of babies, it's about the brains of mothers and parents. At least in Australia, where I live, baby brain is a colloquial term for women during pregnancy and or motherhood feeling foggy and forgetful, and as a colloquial term, some parts of the world might call it mummy brain, other parts of the world might call it pregnancy brain. This idea that you have this subjective kind of memory loss or sense that your brain and your cognition isn't functioning as well as it should. And 4 out of 5 mothers will say that they experience baby brain during pregnancy and or during motherhood. I was one of 5 that didn't. And interestingly to me, I never had heard about it as a concept until my boys are now in high school. My oldest son's nearly graduated from high school. So, it's I'm sort of 17, 18 years down the track now. But I'd never heard of it until many years later. And I always had this thought in my mind. I thought, oh, well, if I didn't know what it was, is that why I didn't experience it? Like, how much is subjective and how much is objective and how much can we actually measure and test? And it's fascinating because there are researchers that have gone in and kind of looked at this. We have these subjective reports of, I feel like my memory isn't as good as it used to be. And then we go in and we can do lots of different types of objective measures. And typically we don't pick up any memory problems whatsoever. The most recent study that was done on this, actually, I was just sent this paper by a colleague of mine. One of the authors on this is Winnie Orchard, who is an Australian who spent some time working in the kind of the mother brain space in the US and has just come back to Australia. And she just did this really large study because if we've got subjective memory loss and then we've got objective testing, it feels a little bit like you're saying to women, oh, well, your experience isn't real. It's all in your head. You've made it up. But there's like a paradox in there to explore, I think. And so they looked at about 400 people. They had 300 parents, half were male, half were female. So half was the birth mother, half was the father. And then they had 100 non-parents. And they got them to do a whole host of different types of cognitive testing. And they could do it in their own time at home, so they were kind of safe and comfortable and relaxed. And they also got people to report on their subjective memory experience. Do I have baby brain? And then they did a lot of different cognitive tests, because sometimes the argument has been, oh, well, perhaps we're just not, that the cognitive tests aren't well designed enough to pick cognitive changes up. We're only using tests that would look for Alzheimer's disease or not. So they did a very complex battery of tests looking at a range of different things. And they found that the parents showed entirely similar performance, the same types of measurements as non-parents. What was really interesting were the male non-fathers, so the dudes who weren't fathers, reported their subjective memory as being better than like anyone else. They were like, my mind is like up here. Does this surprise anyone, right? The non-male fathers were like, my memory's like the shit. And their memory was no different to anyone else. The fathers reported their memory as being, there was quite a difference in the subjective memory score of the fathers and the non-fathers. But objectively, they were all the same. Mothers, fathers, parents who just had babies, parents who had a baby 2 years ago, the dudes who thought they were the shit. Everyone was the same. And so they called, it was quite, let me just look at the conclusion of the paper because they used quite entertaining language for me. What was the word that they used to describe? Oh gosh, sorry, I should have had this up here.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I have to look for the exact term that they use. Basically, that the male non-fathers were supremely confident in their abilities and rated themselves really high.
And where do you think this is coming from? Like how they explain this?
Well, just dudes always think they're the shit. Like male hubris starts like at age 5, right? So little boys grow up with this kind of great sense of confidence. Why had the male fathers shown this subjective memory, saying their memories felt worse, but their memories were not worse? They think it was probably overall sleep and well-being. So overall, like lack of sleep and overall well-being. And certainly there is a bit of evidence that the worse your overall well-being, so you're not getting socially supported, perhaps you've got postnatal depression, perhaps you're really struggling, perhaps you're lacking, so you're just finding parenting really, really tough, then your overall perception of yourself is worse. Even if objectively it's fine, you just like perceive yourself as not performing. And so they think it's just, so baby brain is not necessarily a neurological issue. And this is a message I often try and send out into the world, particularly to mothers. Like, baby brain isn't your brain that's letting you down. It is the structure, it's the ecosystem in which you are trying to parent in. And this, this is constantly being reflected back to you, that if you've got a female body and brain and you add some hormones in starting at puberty, it will equal cognitive dysfunction and decline and instability and baby brain and brain fog and PMS and mood. And, there's this idea that these female brains are fragile. And then we tell ourselves that story, and that's fascinating to me. I say it's not your brain, it's the world that you're parenting within and the expectations you have of yourself. What we also know, what happens to the maternal brain during the course of that first pregnancy, where all of these circuits have been reorganized to respond and react to the baby's cues, and for the brain to become very plastic, to enable you to learn quite rapidly how to look after a baby, to react and respond, because you go through childbirth, it's like wild, and then you're sleep deprived and you're trying to recover from a very traumatic, I don't mean traumatic event, but a big medical event usually. Your entire kind of attention is solely focused in on your new baby. You're utterly consumed by every waking moment, if you can manage to sleep. But when you're awake, you're just thinking about the baby. And memory and your ability to process information depends on your attention. So what information comes in and what you filter out. And when you're focused on the baby, you're not focusing on all of the other things. And so when new mothers forget things because they weren't paying attention in the first place, well, they just blame their brain. They go, it was me and my baby brain, when it's not their brain. It's, it's one, this shift to mothering, and two, just trying to, a brain is trying to do its best in the ecosystem in which it's in. But objectively speaking, these brains are completely functioning normally, which is great news.
Is there like the necessity of the female brain to really go through, all the struggle, and all this really hard work that is the pregnancy for 9 months and then the birth and so on? Like, does it, from a neuroscience perspective, does it form the brain in a way that is necessary, for then really bringing up children properly?
Yeah, definitely. And if we look outside of humans and we look to every other animal in the mammalian kingdom, so if you've got and lots of, we can study like ecologically relevant behaviors in different types of mammals. So say, you're a mother cat, and a cat has kittens, and then the mother wants to keep the kittens close. And if you've ever had a cat with kittens, I remember doing this as a teenager when our cat had kittens. Me and my sister used to put the kittens in different areas around the room, and the cat would just constantly like be going and gathering the kittens. And we see this in rodents as well, like animals that, that that feed their young and nest their young, they're constantly gathering the babies up. A mouse will even start gathering its own tail and its own feet. It will just persist in kind of gathering the babies and keeping it close. And so that's a maternal behaviour that's emerged as a result of pregnancy hormones and then delivering those babies, and then is reinforced by lactation or by feeding milk to those babies. If you're a sheep, right, a sheep's a little bit different because you give birth to a lamb and the lamb can kind of stand up and cruise around and walk all around. It doesn't get held in a nest, but it's within a herd. And so what behaviours does the ewe, the female sheep, need to be able to do? It needs to be able to recognise its lamb out of a flock of there could have been 50 lambs born on that day. And so the baby lamb runs around looking at all the other different mothers, and its own mother recognises its lamb by its smell because it gave birth to that baby, and as soon as that baby's born, it licks that baby, and its olfactory part of its brain, so the part of the brain that's involved with smell and learning and memory, is very plastic and very rapidly learns this precise smell of that baby. So when other lambs come up that don't smell like the baby, that the ewe will kick them away, and the baby lamb learns which one its mother is because it's the only one that doesn't kick it away or push it away. It's the one that welcomes it in for feeding. So a herding mammal the plasticity involves olfaction. That's a different type of plasticity that you would see involved in, like, say, a predator. So you've got an animal that needs to go and hunt and gather and predate food to nourish itself to feed the young. Its reaction times are going to get faster and quicker. So we've got these ecologically relevant maternal behaviours that we see deployed by other mammals. Humans are a little bit different because, traditionally we were allo parents, and that we raised children together in groups, and we always had mother helpers, whereas kind of the current sort of style is, you're alone at home. Maybe if you're lucky enough, your husband's around. If you're super lucky, you might have other helpers, grandmothers or aunties. Or I interviewed quite a lot of women for this book, and there was 3 women in that who had really amazing experiences of first-time early motherhood, and that they didn't have baby brain. They found it, a wonderful experience. And 2 of them were expats living in Asia, where they had live-in hired help, which was fascinating because it wasn't even just a mum or a mother-in-law and a kind auntie. It was literally paid help to help them so they could sleep when they needed to sleep. They could still kind of focus on mothering the baby without having to do housework and all of the other things that we think might be about motherhood, housework or domestic duties or whatever. They didn't have to do that. And another woman said she was going through her medical school training, and her husband was the primary caregiver, and they had a very strong extended family network around them. And so she took a few weeks off and then carried on with her medical school training all through her 3 babies, and is now a psychiatrist. And said, well, I never had baby brain. She said, I didn't know what it was either, but she also had incredibly supportive family around her. So I think women kind of default to thinking there is something wrong with them, when it's really they're just trying to cope as best they can in the system. Is human pregnancy and motherhood preparing mothers for responding and reacting to their babies? The changes that we see, which are largely around social cognition, are around theory of mind and empathy. So what does someone else think and need, and what does someone else feel, and how can I react and respond appropriately? That's like you and your baby, right? That's that dyad, that's that relationship. Doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean as soon as the baby comes out and you're holding it in your arms that you know exactly what to do, or that you feel immediate love, or that, often women are just there going, oh, holy shit, like what have I just done? Or they feel nothing, and that attachment grows over time. But the idea is that your brain is kind of ready and prepared for that process. And what we need is support around you to help you with that, to facilitate that. And that's often what's missing, and that's when the problems start.
To actually go a bit deeper on that point, like, can you describe what happens to the female brain when she's all alone, and she has to juggle the job and the kids and no sleep and whatever, versus when she's like in the support ecosystem, the husband is there to help, there's family there to help, there's maybe even paid help. Like,
Yeah.
is there like a deep difference in the brain specifically?
I don't think we'd see a structural difference, but what we would know would be that I mean, that's a woman who's vulnerable to develop postnatal depression and anxiety, and that's like an absolute, complete, perfect storm for mental health problems, for loneliness and depression, and that's not just a brain problem in that woman. That is like a, you know, if you are depressed and sad and anxious, you can't sleep, you can't care for your baby, and there's some lovely but sad longitudinal studies that have been done looking at women who are identified as suffering. Perhaps they already had prior experiences of depression, but you know they were flagged as suffering from depression when they were still in the maternity hospital, still in the hospital after having had their babies, and have been tracked and followed over time. And that depression, while it doesn't rub off on the kids, it is harder for that mum to be kind of there and present and reactive and responsive to her baby in the way that she probably wants to be. She simply can't. So, you know, that's the perfect storm. When you're going through that post kind of natal time, you know, you are coming off, you are withdrawing from all of those hormones of pregnancy that have been flooding your body. And then, you know, there's this massive hormonal withdrawal. And in some women are very vulnerable or very, very sensitive to normal levels of hormone fluctuations. And it's completely normal to have the withdrawal from pregnancy hormones. It's normal to give birth and for the placenta to detach. That's what happens, right? But what we see that there's a subset of women who kind of go through life and they're sensitive to normal hormonal fluctuations. And we don't actually know exactly what's underpinning that nervous system, brain body sensitivity. They're probably getting PMS. They're the ones that really struggle postnatally. Maybe they found puberty difficult as well. They're very likely to perhaps develop depression when they go through perimenopause and menopause. There's other women who are just like kind of, doesn't matter what their hormone levels are, they're pretty steady and stable through. So you've got, you know, that hormone withdrawal in some women, and then when that's compounded by lack of sleep and lack of social support. Lack of social support's the big one because, you know, that's the greatest risk factor for almost any poor health outcome. Doesn't matter whether you're a new mother or not, whether you're a teenager, whether you're a child, whether you're elderly. Loneliness is incredibly detrimental to brain health. It's one of the well-established risk factors for dementia, is social isolation and loneliness. Now, what is that? In new mums is pretty easy to see. Well, I mean, if you haven't got someone to help you, you can't sleep. You know, you can't. If you're trying to juggle a job as well, like it's just a recipe for an implosion, I would imagine. You'd have to take the baby with you, right? Like if you haven't got childcare. And I mean, I suppose if we kind of cast forward, looking at long-term brain health outcomes, social isolation and loneliness is an interesting one because loneliness is an emotional experience of being alone. Even if you're surrounded by people, you could feel lonely, which is different to being isolated in that there are literally no people around you. But some people like solitude. So one's kind of more of a structural issue and one's more of an emotional issue. But both are risk factors for poor brain health outcomes. And because if you think about interacting with other people, you know, so much of our brain is taken up with processing social cues, whether that be visual cues, whether that be auditory cues. If someone's close enough to us, and particularly a parent-baby bond, like the smell of your new baby, like it's quite powerful. And so much of our brain is taken up with processing that information. And so if you're not processing that information, it's not as cognitively demanding, and we want to keep up cognitively demanding tasks through life. And then there's the pragmatic structural issues. You haven't got someone there to cook you healthy food. You haven't got someone to help you get to the doctor. You haven't got someone to babysit the kids while you're looking after a sick baby. If you're sick, there's no one there to help. And that's throughout the lifespan. So there's, you know, a few different components in there. It's not a brain is functioning in a different way. It's a brain is trying to function in an ecosystem that's not ideal.
And how did we end up here? Because at least in European culture, I'm not sure about Australia, but in European culture, it's normal for the mother to give birth and 3 weeks later, which in my opinion is way too early. They have to go back to work and they have to juggle. It's like, how did we end up in this hyper suboptimal kind of setup where, I mean, you see divorce rates are super high, right? All of the people, a lot of people are really, really unhappy, you know, and
Yeah.
how do we convince the woman that this is kind of the better path than just kind of really focusing on the well-being of the family and also on herself, you
Mm.
know, like how
Don't
do
think
we
we
end up
need
here?
I don't think we need to be convincing the women. I think it's convincing the people. It's convincing the men. It's convincing the husbands. It's convincing the politicians. It's convincing all of the people around those women that they need support. And, you know, the woman I interviewed in my book who went back to work 3 weeks after having her babies, and she was going through her medical school training, those kids have grown up healthy and happy and in a great family, and that marriage is still together because that father was the primary caregiver. So it doesn't have to be the mother. It is more about having strong social networks within that family ecosystem. And it doesn't have to be a traditional family where dad goes to work and mum stays at home. That's not what the issue is. The issue is particularly in those postpartum times that women are nurtured and mothered and looked after as well. So, you know, we've got someone cooking for them and cleaning for them and, you know, doing all of the childcare and doing the hunting and the gathering. And she should just be focusing solely on looking after her baby. Ideally, no one would have to rush back to work. But if you want to go back to work, great. But if you've got, you know, you want to have the right sort of social support systems around you, I certainly would never make a case that I think women should stay at home with their babies for a really long time. I think that what we need is social support to enable women to have the choice to be able to kind of raise the babies in the way that they need to. And for the you know, other parents who are involved, whether they be dads or other kind of helpers or other, you know, allo parenting, you know, family members, to be there and to provide the support to that mother and that baby. Because that's really where, you know, when there's these gaps. I spoke to a women's health psychiatrist for this book who talks a lot about postnatal depression and risk factors for that. And she talks a lot about sleep. Of course, it goes without saying that if you have disrupted sleep for days or weeks or months, it is really, really hard to recover, and it's kind of hand in hand with early parenthood. And she talks about calling on the cavalry. And if you are breastfeeding, once breastfeeding is established, you know, can you pump and get someone else to give the baby the first feed at night so that woman can get a good solid block of sleep through the night? And that was what me and my husband did when my babies were born. I didn't have any trouble breastfeeding and establishing, and I had a lot of milk. And I would pump and express the first bottle, and I'd be in bed asleep. Baby would be down. I'd be in bed asleep by sort of 8:30. This is after sort of a few weeks in. And then my husband would give the baby a bottle at about 11, and then he would probably not wake then until 2 or 3 a.m. So I could have had 6 hours sleep, good solid sleep, before I was woken for the first time. And that protected my mental health. And we decided very, very early on that that was how we were going to do that, because it protected my sleep and it meant he had a really cool, special thing to do with the baby. It just worked really, really well for us. And I don't think I was lucky to have a supportive husband. Like everyone, like, that's not luck. Like everyone deserves, they should have that, right? That was how we did it in our family. So calling on the cavalry is fundamentally important. But women have just been taught to blame their brains when they're not coping. They think it's a neurological deficit, and it never is that. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's largely not that.
No, I think I agree with you. I think really it's more the structure around it, because you see it in the Eastern culture, you know, Eastern European culture. There, if you have the first child, I don't know, you get like a years of off. Parents,
Mm,
at least the mother, I think, the father, I'm not
yeah,
sure. And then with the second baby, you even get money. With the third baby, you even get an apartment, from what I
yeah, yeah,
understand.
yeah, yeah,
And this really, it encourages, you know, the people to
yeah,
have kids. And if you have
yeah,
realistically a family of 3, the mother has 3 years to really focus on the family, if this is what she wants, of course.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
this is just a completely different story than, well, a bit more than 2 months that you get, at least in
yeah.
Switzerland.
In
And
different parts, yeah. In different parts of the
mm,
world have got different paternity and maternity and parental leave policies. I mean, the US obviously is a very famous example of not very having very much, but different companies will have different leave policies. And, you know, I think there's a real recognition now that parental leave is what's important, and if both parents can be involved or can kind of tag team, that's a really great thing. And, women are still humans and people too. We don't just become mothers who don't need other kind of things in our lives. And there's a massive identity shift that comes with particularly first-time motherhood. We use this word matrescence now to describe that kind of becoming of a mother. So, of course, your brain is shaped and sculpted by that, but then you've got these new little people or person in your life. And you're continually reacting and responding and learning and growing and up-leveling. And I've got teenage boys now, and it's just as much of a challenge, but in a completely different way as was when they were little, kind of toddlers running around, when it was like this kind of daily grind and you were always on. And it was really, really tiring and hard, but they were so cute. They were so cute. And now they're not as cute. They're handsome, strapping, good-looking young men who don't need me in the same way, and then I'm like, I have the fate of every mammalian mother, which is ideally you raise, them to be independent, and they want to kind of go out in the world and go off to university and go off traveling and do all of that. And I'm kind of counting down the days until my oldest son does that. It's not long now. And ideally, and that's like the kind of the next phase. And that's why parenting is so cognitively demanding and resilience building and so good for you, because you're constantly having to up level. You're constantly having to learn how to parent a child at the age and stage they're at and who that kid is. And it's a real challenge, but it's, really awesome at the same time. It's the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, and it's hard. Like right now, I'm at this point where I'm, I can't hold on. You can't hold on to them. You can't put a lid on the nest. You have to let them fly free, and it breaks your heart, but you're so proud at the same time. And that's a real challenge, I think, for lots of parents. I know my husband and I, we both just turned 50. And he spends so much time on his phone looking at videos of the boys when they were really little because it was so cute. It's just a real shift in identity, I think, having to decide who you are as a parent at each new stage of parenting. And it's tough, but that doesn't mean it's a brain problem. It's just it's a life. It's, just a life phase.
And what's like the one thing the husbands can do to really support in this phase? Because I'm literally asking for myself, because we're probably
Goodness.
going
Asking
through
for a
this
friend.
rather soon. Yeah, exactly. Asking for a friend. So and now actually one of our close friends, they found out that they're pregnant. And it's funny because now her husband, he's doing anything. Like the fridge is filled up, the house
Good.
is clean, anything. Hey,
Good.
ChatGPT, what can I do to make my wife happy now?
He should ask ChatGPT about the emotional load and the emotional labor of motherhood, because as soon as women become mothers, then they take on like the vast share of the domestic duties. It's almost as if by default becoming a mother means you have to then become a housewife and a domestic servant. So I think the first step for men is the awareness of parenting and mothering not being synonymous with housewifery and servitude and domestic duties, that actually when women are pregnant and when they are mothers, the men should be taking on the vast amount of all of that labour and work. And mothers need to be mothered too, particularly in the late, during labour and delivery. That's kind of a wild time. But in those first kind of weeks, months, and even years of motherhood, mothers need to be looked after and mothered and nurtured, and the men should be doing the absolute utter lion's share of the domestic duties in the house, because women's brains have been tuned and sculpted to be thinking about the baby, not folding her husband's undies and remembering to buy him his magazine and his groceries and the newspaper and remind him to go to the doctor. So, men need to be stepping up and not being little boys. Like they didn't, their wife hasn't become their mum. And I think a lot of men kind of slip back into that. And I also think that, especially in those early kind of weeks or months when babies aren't sleeping, I have heard that there's a bit of a debate as to whether you should both be up and awake at the same time or whether you should tag team. And certainly me and my husband were very much in the tag team camp, where He kind of, we often think he almost did kind of parenting duties from kind of, 7 a.m. through till 2 a.m. And then I could just switch off. I could sleep. I could get that really good, deep restorative sleep. And well, he parented and I had to let go. And the baby had milk. It had a parent. The baby was fine. He took over the duties. And then come 2 a.m., I'd had my sleep and I could wake up and do the kind of the second half of the night. And I think we need more men to be stepping up and saying that this is what's going to happen. This is how it's not railroading anyone, but offering that and then encourage. And then we need women to understand that then the baby's going to build a relationship with their other parent, with their dad. And that can save sleep and that can save sanity and that can save marriages, I think. There's nothing, but it just once the only caveat there is if the mother's breastfeeding needs to be well established for that to happen. But if for whatever reason you're choosing to bottle feed, like that could be done from day one, right? It's not rocket science. It's not even neuroscience.
Yeah, it sounds quite cool, honestly.
My wise lady
father,
advice to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds quite cool because I would be quite hyped, to, I don't know, from 7, 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. We kind of have a bit of father-daughter or father-son time. Why not?
Take over.
That would be lovely.
And the thing with sleep is that when you when you are sleep deprived, you'll fall into a very deep sleep. And when you're woken up from that deep sleep by the baby crying, it is like swimming through treacle. It is so hard to come up out of that sleep. You're 90 minutes in. It is so hard to wake up and then it's hard to get back to sleep again. Whereas if you've already had 6 hours, you've gone through all of your deep sleep and you're in lighter sleep anyway, it's much easier to wake up. And whilst it's disruptive and it might be harder to get back to sleep later on, it means you've kind of got your good chunk of deep sleep out of the way. And so you can have turns at doing that. There are some people that think, well, both of you should get up at the same time, but then you've got 2 tired people. It's much more helpful to have one person who's not so tired. And like the dads, if they're like working out, you're going off to an office or you've got some other job, or, you don't have to be staying awake that whole time, right? You can just be the first on call. Like when the baby cries, you're the one that gets up, or you sleep in the room with the baby and mum goes and sleeps somewhere else. You can make it work, especially when you're getting through those months before babies establish kind of more regular sleep patterns. I think you've got to kind of focus everything in on that, and that's essentially what paternity leave or parental leave for fathers or the other caregiver should be about. It should be about focusing everything in on. You should be doing everything. Hot tip.
Now, what's one friendly tip you could give him? Because I'm quite a diva, If I get less than, let's say, 7 hours of sleep, ideally 8, how can I condition myself to work with, I don't know, 5 or 6? Is there a way?
That's a real bro attitude. Mothers do this all of the time because we have to. So you just have to suck it up. You could then, like, say you feed the baby at 11, you go to sleep. Maybe your wife gets up at 2. You'll sleep from midnight until 6. You'll be fine. You're not the baby. You're not the child. Like, you have to not be a diva. You're a dad now. It's time to put on your big boy, your dad pants.
Because what I notice about myself is if I have something to wake up to in the morning, for example, today, podcast we started in my local time, 8 a.m. So at 7 a.m. we were up sharp, not a problem. But if there's nothing to wake up to, then for some reason it's much harder. So I can imagine that if you
Once
have a child,
have a baby, that changes.
Exactly. So you always have something to wake up to.
They are going to be there for the rest of their lives.
Exactly.
So they will be there, and you just get used to. And especially, I would say up until they're about 7 years old, maybe 6. It depends which age you start screens, right? They wake up, and sometimes once they start sleeping through the night, sometimes they are up at 5 or 6 a.m. and they're up for the day, and you can't just, you have to get up with them. And then if someone's exhausted, then, you can take turns. So I do think it's about understanding that you are the father now. You are not, your wife didn't become mum to you. You need to man up. you need to take on all of the housework, all of those duties, and she needs to be recovering and focusing in on getting her sleep and looking after the, feeding the baby, and then, sharing that kind of time, because it's a really precious time, and it's so incredibly overwhelming, and it's such a lot. And it's only when you look back on it, you realize how precious it was and how fast it goes. And it doesn't feel like it when you're in the middle of it at all. The days feel very, very long, but the years just fly by. And I think that happy, it's everyone will be happier if everyone is well slept.
Yeah, honestly, I might give you a call when the time comes with one or two questions.
It's not complicated.
Oh no. What's one big myth you'd like to bust about the female brain specifically?
I think that definitely there's this idea, and I think I kind of hinted at it, or at least said earlier, that once brains hit puberty, there's this conversation that girls are hormonal, and puberty, they're moody through puberty, and they get PMS, and girls and women are very emotional, and they can't kind of control their emotions, and that it's all about a brain that doesn't quite function right. And that's absolutely not the case. And the more we kind of focus in on things going wrong, the more we look at them, and we don't look at the strengths and the upsides. We don't look at the strengths and the upsides of a brain that's gone through pregnancy and becomes a mother. That brain's more flexible and responsive and efficient. And in fact, all of the doses of hormones and then the cognitive skilling of parenting makes the maternal brain healthier in old age than a brain that hasn't gone through pregnancy and motherhood. So there's so many benefits to these life experiences we go through. The female brains are incredibly plastic and adaptive and responsive, and have to be. Yet we kind of think about them as being other than or overly emotional. I suppose there's this age-old story about female hysteria, whereby women are more emotional than men, and it's due to their hormones. I don't know what it's like in Switzerland, although I have heard stories, because I understand it's a reasonably patriarchal country. But I know if I'm in Australia and I'm driving along the road and someone comes up behind me and toots because you're going too slow, or you don't start quick enough from the light, or there's some kind of ragey incident, or there's a couple of people having a fight in a pub, or there's some kind of yelling or rage event somewhere. It's not like girls and women doing that. It's dudes, right? It's men. It's men who have a lot of trouble with managing their emotions in many ways. And there's this story that it's women who are emotional and hysterical, and I think that we forget that perhaps humans are. There's a researcher I interviewed for one of my books called Adrienne Beltz. I actually have her paper up on my computer at the moment because I was talking about it earlier. She published it in Scientific Reports back in 2003, I think 2002 or 3. And essentially they went and looked at they had a couple of hundred people, half women, half men. Half the women were naturally cycling and half the women were on oral contraceptives, which kind of flatline, their cyclical hormones. And then they were testing their bloods to see what kind of blood hormone levels they had. And then they got everyone to look. They were doing kind of objective measures of emotionality, and so there was kind of like 10 options of every day they were asked to report on like kind of what was the emotion that you were reporting that day. And so there was 10 positive emotions like happy or proud or energetic, and then there were 10 negative emotions like irritable or afraid or angry, and then they had to report them on a 5-point scale, like 1 hardly at all to 5 very extremely, and then looked across all of the men and all of the women. And they didn't find any differences across the groups. Women weren't more emotional with deeper emotions. Everyone was very, very similar. And in fact, some of the men showed much greater variation in their emotions than the women. the kind of the outliers on the kind of extremes there were the men. So there's not even any objective evidence that women are more emotional and men are more stable. It's just this gendered stereotype, which has been kind of rattling around in different kind of sizes and shapes and forms for many years. And it just kind of then gets brought back to this idea, well, it's something to do with the female brain being kind of fragile or other than or in comparison to the norm, which is the male. And that's not what any data is supporting.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
And what is one simple thing I can do to really boost my brain health, man or female, doesn't matter?
I think one is sleep, and that's hard when you're a new parent, but I've given you a strategy. Sleep is the absolute bedrock of everything else that you're going to build on top of that. If you haven't got sleep, the exercise, the diet, all of the other stuff's just going to fall to the wayside, because my dog's asleep next to me on the floor. He sleeps a lot because dogs do, right? But we can't escape that we need to sleep every 24 hours. We've spent a fair whack of that time. So sleep, getting that kind of well established. And then the next thing I think is social support and having good, healthy relationships. And that's the greatest predictor of health outcomes. So the Harvard longitudinal study that's been following like the same group of men since they were college students, they're now in their 80s, has looked, I think the study's just come out recently as well, the latest update. It's looked at, what's the greatest predictor of health outcomes at age 80 is your social relationship status in midlife. How well socially connected were you? And everyone's talking about, I always joke about the ice bath boys. There's ice baths and there's phones and there's gut health and there's, walnuts and there's creatine and there's, everyone's walking around barefoot. I don't know what the latest thing is. Watching, Andrew Huberman's watching his sunrises. There's all of these things that people are doing, and people get very pious and take well-being very seriously, when actually you need to be having a laugh with your mates. And I don't think enough people are understanding that. And then that just brings it right back to pregnancy and motherhood for women. What's the greatest source of stress or the greatest protection against struggling is other people, having other people around.
So yeah, back to the basics. I mean,
it is, there's nothing, it's not magic, right? It's not rocket surgery. It's just we're these kind of, we're just basic biological mammals, and I think we're trying to think our way out of it all. But yeah.
Well, Sarah, it's been a very insightful answer. I learned a thing or two, and I think especially the part about the fatherhood is a strategy that is interesting. And I'm going to give it a try when the time comes. You have my word.
Your wife will thank me.
Yes, I'll hook you up to both of you, and she'll be very happy about it, I think.
There's a chapter in here on fathers and parenting, but honestly, that's what it all comes down to. This is your time to shine and to take over and to do all of the duties, and hopefully you run your own company. You can give yourself a good parental leave package and give yourself, good 6 months to a year to step up and take over the house and be happy times. When's your wife due?
No, I mean, she's not pregnant yet. But
okay.
we're just now it's kind of the time where everyone in our circle is starting to do it, and we anyway want to do it. Like, we knew this from the very beginning, so now it's just, I don't know, the moment when it gets more concrete, it gets you really start to think about it, like how are you going to handle this, how are you going to handle that. And again, it's all no rocket science. I think even if you talk to my own mom, to my grandma, like they all kind of tell the same story, but it shows that there's probably a bit of truth in that.
Yeah, it's age-old wisdom. It's also what you've told me today. The wisdom of mothers. Well, you know what? As a company founder, your job is to go away and come up with a really good parental leave policy that also enables the fathers to be there as much as the mothers in the baby's lives.
Yeah, I mean, my companies are fully remote already, so basically people can, I always say, you can do whatever the hell you want as long as the one or two things are met that should be met. And I think that's actually really Yeah, a really good approach, because it gives the father the
I
opportunity,
think
even at 2 a.m., if he wants to do something.
That's flexibility, but I still think it's nice to be able to switch off completely and just focus in on, focus in on that. But that's your business.
And how long would you say that should be in like a healthy way? Like, what would be your recommendation here?
I mean, some companies in some parts of the world have a year for each parent. You could have the mum has a year and then the dad has a year. So just have a look across the world and look to see what different parts of the world offer. I don't know why Switzerland always lags behind, but what are they doing in the Nordic countries? What are they doing in Australia? Eastern Europe, like you say, they've got some pretty good policies in place. So, the templates are out there, and everyone's different, and everyone's experience of this is going to be different. You don't know what kind of baby you're going to have. You might have twins. You might, your wife might have a terrible labour and delivery, and it might take her weeks before she can even walk around properly. You might not be able to establish breastfeeding easily. There's lots and lots of things that can that you can't anticipate. And it's a massive identity change and a life-altering experience. But and then something, and then they leave you.
What a scam, right?
I know, it's a scam. It is. It's really quite heartbreaking.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Call your mum as well. Call your mum. That's my other bit of advice.
I'll do it right away. Okay, right after this, I promise.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much. It was a great talk, and would love to have you back on the show one day. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
See ya.